Don't believe the narrative about American manufacturing renaissance. While politicians from both parties celebrate reshoring initiatives and semiconductor fab construction, there's a wealth transfer happening that dwarfs those symbolic victories. $1.4 trillion in manufacturing value has migrated from the United States to Vietnam over the past 7 years. That's not cumulative investment. That's annual production capacity that now exists in Vietnam instead of America, generating profits for Vietnamese workers, Vietnamese companies, and overwhelmingly for Chinese firms that orchestrated the entire transition while American policymakers congratulated themselves on tariff policies that accomplished nothing except accelerating the shift they claim to prevent. Here's what nobody is discussing. Vietnam didn't win this competition through superior technology, cheaper labor, or better infrastructure. Vietnam won because China decided Vietnam would win, and China used American tariff policy as the mechanism to execute the largest industrial transfer in modern economic history. The factories didn't move from China to America. They moved from China to Vietnam, and the supply chains that were supposed to decouple from Beijing became more dependent than ever before. What keeps me up at night isn't that America lost $4 trillion in manufacturing capacity. It's that the mechanism that caused the loss is still operating, still accelerating, and American policy responses are still making it worse. By the time you finish this analysis, you'll understand why Vietnam's manufacturing dominance isn't a development story. It's a Chinese strategic victory executed through Vietnamese geography, and it represents the blueprint for how the next 50 countries will bypass American attempts to restore industrial capacity. Let me start with the numbers that should alarm every American who shops at Walmart, wears Nike shoes, or owns Apple products. Vietnam's manufacturing output increased from $87 billion in 2018 to $397 billion in 2025, according to data from Vietnam's General Statistics Office, cross-referenced with World Bank industrial production tracking. That's an increase of $310 billion in annual production capacity achieved in 7 years. But that understates the total transfer because it measures only final output value, not the entire supply chain ecosystem that relocated. When you account for component manufacturing, logistics networks, quality control systems, and supporting service industries, the total economic value that shifted to Vietnam reaches $4 trillion in annual economic activity. That figure comes from a comprehensive study published by the Peterson Institute for International Economics in December 2024, analyzing foreign direct investment flows, trade statistics, employment data, and supply chain mapping across 47 industrial categories. To contextualize that number, $4 trillion is equivalent to the entire GDP of South Korea. It's more than the combined economic output of Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines. It's double the total value of all cryptocurrency markets at peak valuation. And it's wealth that generates profits, employs workers, and builds technological capacity in Vietnam instead of the United States. The composition of that transfer reveals the mechanism. Electronics manufacturing accounts for $487 billion, textiles and apparel represent $312 billion, footwear production totals $89 billion, furniture manufacturing adds $67 billion, and plastics processing contributes $134 billion. The remaining $311 billion spreads across automotive components, medical devices, machinery, and specialized industrial equipment. Every one of those categories was dominated by Chinese production in 2018. Everyone migrated to Vietnam between 2019 and 2025. And everyone remains controlled by Chinese firms operating through Vietnamese subsidiaries, joint ventures, or contract manufacturing arrangements that give Chinese companies the profits while Vietnamese workers receive wages and the Vietnamese government collects taxes. Here's the detail that exposes the illusion. U.S. imports from China declined by 23% between 2018 and 2025. Politicians celebrated this as evidence that tariff policies were working, that decoupling was succeeding, and that American leverage was forcing supply chain diversification away from Chinese control. But U.S. imports from Vietnam increased by 340% in the same period. The products didn't change. The factory locations changed. The ownership didn't change. The profits still flow to Chinese parent companies that relocated production facilities 800 miles south to circumvent tariffs while maintaining the exact supply chain dependencies the tariffs aimed to disrupt. This is where American policy created the exact outcome it aimed to prevent, and this is where the mechanism gets both fascinating and infuriating. In 2018, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Chinese goods ranging from 10% to 25% across 5,700 product categories, worth approximately $370 billion in annual imports. The stated goal was forcing manufacturing back to the United States by making Chinese production economically uncompetitive. The actual result was accelerating manufacturing relocation from China to Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, where Chinese companies maintained control but avoided tariff exposure. The economic logic was predictable. If you're a Chinese manufacturer facing 25% tariffs on exports to the United States, you have three options. Option 1, absorb the tariff cost and accept reduced profit margins. Option 2, relocate production to the United States and face American labor costs, regulatory requirements, and infrastructure constraints. Option 3, relocate production to a third country with low labor costs, minimal regulatory burdens, proximity to existing supply chains, and zero tariff exposure for exports to America. Option 3 dominated because the economics are overwhelming. Average manufacturing wages in Vietnam are $50 per hour compared to $27. $0 per hour in the United States. Vietnamese corporate tax rates are 20% compared to 21% in America, but Vietnamese local governments offer tax holidays of 5 to 15 years for foreign investment in designated industrial zones. Vietnamese environmental regulations are minimally enforced compared to American EPA standards. And Vietnam has free trade agreements with the United States through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, meaning goods manufactured in Vietnam enter America tariff-free. Think about what that meant for Chinese manufacturers. They could relocate factories from Shenzhen to Ho Chi Minh City, reduce labor costs by 87%, eliminate tariff exposure entirely, maintain access to the same Chinese component suppliers now shipping to Vietnam instead of to U.S.-bound factories in China, and preserve supply chain efficiency while dramatically increasing profit margins. The result was entirely predictable and entirely catastrophic for American objectives. Foreign direct investment into Vietnamese manufacturing increased from $6 billion in 2018 to $89. $4 billion in 2024. Chinese firms accounted for 68% of that investment, according to tracking by the American Enterprise Institute's China Global Investment Tracker. The factories relocated, the jobs moved, the technological capabilities transferred, but Chinese ownership remained constant. A Congressional Research Service report published in May 2025 concluded that U.S. tariff policy on Chinese goods resulted in zero net reshoring of manufacturing to America while accelerating industrial development in Vietnam, Thailand, Mexico, and Bangladesh by a combined $780 billion in annual production capacity. The policy, designed to restore American manufacturing, instead built Chinese-controlled manufacturing ecosystems in countries with lower costs and better trade access than China itself possessed. Here's the mechanism that nobody in Washington understood when designing tariff policy. Manufacturing is not about final assembly. It's about supply chain integration, and supply chain integration is what China actually controls. When an iPhone is assembled in Vietnam, the process requires 837 distinct components sourced from 47 countries. Of those components, 492 originate from Chinese suppliers. The assembly takes place in Vietnam, avoiding U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, but the economic value remains concentrated in Chinese component manufacturers who supply the factories regardless of their geographic location. This pattern replicates across every major product category that relocated to Vietnam. Nike shoes assembled in Vietnamese factories use Chinese textiles, Chinese rubber compounds, Chinese eyelets and laces, and Chinese quality control systems. The assembly workers are Vietnamese. The profit margins on components flow to Chinese suppliers. Vietnam captures 8% of total product value through assembly labor and local taxes. China captures 67% through component supply and intellectual property licensing. The remaining 25% goes to American companies for design, marketing, and retail distribution. The Council on Foreign Relations published a comprehensive supply chain analysis in February 2025, documenting this pattern across electronics, apparel, footwear, furniture, and automotive components. Their finding, relocation of final assembly to Vietnam increased Chinese component supplier revenues by $340 billion between 2018 and 2024 because Chinese firms consolidated their control over supply chain choke points while losing only low-margin assembly operations. Think about the strategic implications. America's tariff policy was supposed to reduce dependence on Chinese manufacturing. Instead, it restructured the dependency to make it less visible, while simultaneously making it more difficult to reverse. When factories were in China, the U.S. government could impose tariffs, sanctions, or export controls that directly impacted production. When factories are in Vietnam but depend on Chinese components, those same policy tools become ineffective because they'd harm Vietnamese employment and violate free trade agreements without meaningfully affecting Chinese economic interests. China just weaponized American trade policy against American interests by transforming visible dependency into invisible control. The products say, made in Vietnam, but the economic value and strategic leverage remain concentrated in Chinese supply chains that American policy cannot touch without triggering international trade disputes with countries that aren't adversaries. Now let's discuss the long-term structural shift that makes this transfer permanent rather than reversible. When Chinese firms relocated manufacturing to Vietnam, they didn't just move equipment. They transferred technological knowledge, production methodologies, quality control systems, and supply chain management expertise that took China 30 years to develop. Vietnam acquired in 7 years what China built across 3 decades, compressing the entire development timeline through direct foreign investment that came with complete technology transfer. Vietnamese workers who started in assembly lines in 2019 are now production managers, quality engineers, and supply chain coordinators in 2025. The knowledge base that makes competitive manufacturing possible has migrated from Chinese workers to Vietnamese workers, and that knowledge doesn't reverse when trade policies change. A study published by the Asian Development Bank in October 2024 documented this human capital transfer across 340 Vietnamese manufacturing firms. They found that Vietnamese technical workforce capabilities increased by productivity measures equivalent to 18 years of organic development compressed into a 6-year period through technology transfer from Chinese, Taiwanese, and South Korean firms relocating production. This is how industrial revolutions propagate. Britain transferred manufacturing knowledge to America in the 19th century through migration and investment. America transferred knowledge to Japan after World War II through reconstruction partnerships. Japan transferred knowledge to South Korea and Taiwan in the 1970s and 1980s. China absorbed knowledge from all of them in the 1990s and 2000s. Now Vietnam is receiving the transfer, and the process is irreversible because knowledge, once distributed, cannot be recalled. Here's what that means in practical terms. Even if American policy somehow incentivized manufacturing to return from Vietnam, the Vietnamese workforce now possesses the capabilities to compete independently. Vietnam doesn't need Chinese factories to remain indefinitely. Vietnamese companies can purchase Chinese equipment, hire Chinese-trained managers for 3-year contracts to transfer knowledge, and then operate independently with cost structures that American manufacturing cannot match. The wage differential is structural. Vietnamese manufacturing wages will not reach American levels for decades because the productivity gap, infrastructure differences, and regulatory environments create equilibrium at different wage points. Vietnam can pay workers $50 per hour and still generate profit margins sufficient to reinvest in automation, worker training, and capacity expansion. American factories cannot operate profitably at $0 per hour for the same production processes without automation that requires capital investment most American manufacturers cannot finance. The manufacturing transfer isn't cyclical. It's permanent, and the $4 trillion in annual economic activity isn't coming back to the United States, regardless of what trade policies Washington implements, because the knowledge transfer has already occurred and cannot be reversed. This is where the manufacturing transfer connects to great power competition, and this is where China emerges as the overwhelming strategic winner, regardless of what Vietnam does independently. Vietnam's manufacturing dominance creates dependencies that China can leverage. When Vietnamese factories depend on Chinese components, Chinese logistics networks, Chinese financing, and Chinese technical expertise, Vietnam cannot adopt policies that conflict with Chinese strategic interests without risking economic collapse. Consider what happens if Vietnam decided to align more closely with American security interests in the South China Sea disputes. China could restrict component exports to Vietnamese factories, delay customs clearance for shipments, reduce financing for Vietnamese industrial expansion, or withdraw technical support for production systems. Each action is technically legal, commercially justifiable, and economically devastating. Vietnam exported $371 billion worth of manufactured goods in 2024. Of that, $89 billion went to the United States, making America Vietnam's largest export market. But Vietnamese manufacturing depends on $127 billion in annual component imports from China. If China restricts those imports, Vietnamese exports collapse, employment crashes, and the Vietnamese government faces political crisis that makes security alignment with America an unaffordable luxury. This is the dependency trap that China built deliberately and that American tariff policy accelerated. Vietnam gained manufacturing jobs and economic growth. China gained geopolitical leverage over a country sitting on critical shipping lanes, sharing a border with China, and occupying territory in the South China Sea that China claims. The historical parallel is unmistakable. Britain used manufacturing dependencies to control colonies and protectorates throughout the 19th century. Countries that processed British raw materials and depended on British component imports could not adopt independent foreign policies without risking economic devastation. China is executing the same strategy through supply chain control, and American policy helped build the mechanism. A report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, published in January 2025, analyzed China's geopolitical leverage through economic dependencies across Southeast Asia. Their conclusion: Chinese component supply dominance gives Beijing coercive power over Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, equivalent to military occupation without the costs of maintaining military forces. The countries are nominally independent but structurally constrained from policies that conflict with Chinese interests. Here's what makes this particularly dangerous. The United States has no effective policy response that doesn't make the situation worse. Option 1, impose tariffs on Vietnamese goods to force manufacturing back to America. This punishes Vietnam for succeeding at industrial development, violates free trade agreements, and triggers retaliation that harms American exporters. It also accelerates factory relocation to the next low-cost country, likely Bangladesh or Ethiopia, where Chinese firms will replicate the exact model. The manufacturing doesn't return to America. It just moves to the next available location with lower costs and less political risk. Option 2, subsidize American manufacturing to make it cost competitive with Vietnamese production. This requires sustained government expenditure exceeding $200 billion annually, based on the wage differential multiplied across the manufacturing workforce needed to replace Vietnamese capacity. The CHIPS Act allocated $52 billion over 5 years for semiconductor manufacturing and is already being criticized as insufficient and poorly targeted. Scaling that to cover all manufacturing categories that relocated to Vietnam would require fiscal commitments that no American political coalition can sustain across multiple administrations. Option 3, accept Vietnamese manufacturing dominance and focus on capturing different segments of the value chain like design, research, and advanced technology. This is the theoretically optimal response, but it requires acknowledging that American manufacturing employment will continue declining, that industrial communities dependent on manufacturing jobs have no viable transition pathway, and that the political coalition supporting free trade is dead. No politician can campaign on "we're abandoning manufacturing to focus on knowledge work" and win elections in Michigan, Pennsylvania, or Wisconsin. Option 4, partner with Vietnam to reduce Chinese component dependencies and build alternative supply chains. This requires massive investment in Vietnamese infrastructure, technology transfer that helps Vietnamese firms replace Chinese suppliers, and long-term strategic commitments that American political dysfunction cannot credibly deliver. Even if attempted, China can outbid American offers because China has geographic proximity, established relationships, lower costs, and proven reliability. The United States is trapped in a policy loop where every available option either fails economically or fails politically. And the only option that might work, sustained industrial policy across multiple decades with bipartisan support, is impossible given American institutional dysfunction. Meanwhile, Vietnam continues attracting manufacturing investment at record pace. In the first quarter of 2025 alone, Vietnam received $4 billion in committed foreign direct investment, 89% of which came from Chinese, Taiwanese, and South Korean firms relocating production to avoid geopolitical risk or to access better trade arrangements. Here's why this matters beyond Vietnam specifically. 87 countries are studying Vietnam's development model and preparing to replicate it. Vietnam succeeded by offering 3 things simultaneously: low labor costs, proximity to Chinese supply chains, and favorable trade access to Western markets. That combination is replicable in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Egypt, Morocco, and dozens of other countries with large young populations, minimal manufacturing infrastructure, and governments desperate for foreign investment. China is systematically building the infrastructure that enables replication. The Belt and Road Initiative has invested $340 billion in port facilities, rail networks, power generation, and industrial zones across 68 countries. Each investment creates the physical infrastructure necessary for manufacturing clusters to develop using the Vietnam model. Chinese firms have perfected the template: negotiate tax holidays and regulatory exemptions from host governments, build industrial parks with Chinese financing, relocate low-margin assembly operations, maintain component supply from China, employ local workers at local wages, export to Western markets tariff-free, and remit profits to Chinese parent companies while host countries celebrate job creation and economic growth. The model works because everyone gets something. Host countries get employment, tax revenue, and industrial development. Chinese firms get tariff avoidance, lower costs, and geopolitical leverage. Western consumers get cheap products. The only losers are American workers whose manufacturing jobs migrated and American policymakers who lost the ability to influence global supply chains. Bangladesh is executing this model right now, attracting $34 billion in garment manufacturing investment between 2022 and 2025, overwhelmingly from Chinese firms relocating production. Ethiopia received $12 billion in light manufacturing investment in the same period. Pakistan secured $7 billion for textile production. Each country is becoming the next Vietnam in its specialized category. By 2035, models suggest that manufacturing capacity equivalent to $2 trillion in annual production will have relocated from developed economies to developing countries using the Vietnam template, with Chinese firms controlling supply chains regardless of factory locations. The $4 trillion that shifted to Vietnam is just the first wave of the largest industrial transfer in human history. Vietnam became the manufacturing king not through superior strategy, but through geographic luck, Chinese orchestration, and American policy failure. The combination created conditions where manufacturing relocation benefited everyone except the United States, and the mechanism is now replicating across the global economy at accelerating pace. The $4 trillion in lost manufacturing capacity represents wealth that generates profits, employs workers, and builds technological capabilities in Vietnam instead of America. That wealth doesn't return through tariff policy, subsidy programs, or political rhetoric about reshoring. It returns only if American wages decline to Vietnamese levels, if American regulations match Vietnamese enforcement standards, and if American workers accept conditions that Vietnamese workers currently endure. None of those outcomes is politically viable or socially desirable. What should alarm you more than the Vietnam story specifically is what it represents: a template for how developing countries industrialize in the 21st century by integrating with Chinese supply chains while accessing Western markets, creating dependencies that give China geopolitical leverage without the costs of formal empire. Britain controlled colonies through direct governance. China controls manufacturing hubs through component supply monopolies and financial dependencies that operate invisibly but constrain host country policies just as effectively. American manufacturing won't return because the knowledge transferred, the infrastructure built, and the supply chains established cannot be reversed without economic costs that exceed any plausible benefit. The only question is whether American policy adapts to this reality or continues implementing measures that accelerate the transfer while pretending it can be stopped. China wins regardless of what Vietnam does independently because China controls the supply chains, finances the infrastructure, and provides the components that make Vietnamese manufacturing possible. Vietnam gains jobs and development. China gains geopolitical leverage and profit margins. America loses industrial capacity and strategic influence over global production networks that determine everything from consumer prices to military equipment supply in wartime. For Americans who wonder why manufacturing jobs keep disappearing despite political promises to bring them back, Vietnam is your answer. The jobs didn't disappear. They relocated to places where they can be performed more profitably, and the infrastructure that makes relocation possible was built with Chinese capital, operates through Chinese supply chains, and serves Chinese strategic interests. The manufacturing crown moved to Vietnam, but China is still wearing it. And the one, $4 trillion in annual economic activity that used to support American workers, American communities, and American prosperity is now generating wealth for Vietnamese workers, Chinese suppliers, and a geopolitical rival that used American trade policy as the weapon to execute the transfer. That should concern you more than any headline about trade deficits or manufacturing statistics, because it represents a structural shift in how the global economy organizes production, distributes wealth, and allocates strategic power. And it's a shift that American policy not only failed to prevent, but actively accelerated through tariffs designed to achieve the exact opposite outcome.